Alrighty. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate you spending the time to be here, and I hope and pray it's a useful session for everybody, and that we all get something out of it, myself included, as we consider different perspectives and what sort of things. And so I started really small with why are we here. Let's just tackle the big issues first, because why not? And the reason I do that is to give this series context, essentially. The goal of these is to give you guys, to give you knowledge, but secondly, to give you the power to understand and analyze information so that you can work these things out for yourself as well. And so I'll be going through different tips and tricks as to how to do that as time goes on. Because as you know, we live in a data-driven society. There's always stats and all sorts of different things going on. I want to empower you guys to kind of engage with that and understand that. Because the more study we do in psychology, the more we realize how our brains work and how we can fall into biases or kind of mental traps, and they can influence our beliefs and where we end up with different things as well. So I also want to have the opportunity to share things from a Christian perspective, because it's not a narrative you'll commonly hear in the media. Unless you're actively engaged in that and looking for that, you're not likely to come across it at all. And so that's a full disclosure of my bias there. I'm a practicing, believing Christian. That's where I come from. But my background is very much science and understanding the facts and how they can be interpreted in different ways. As I find that often, assumptions can be taken for granted. And as you probably know, people don't always examine the things that they could be. They don't always examine their assumptions to the extent that they might have. And if you are a believer, I want to empower you to understand why you believe what you do, and also to be able to communicate that to others if they're interested in hearing those sorts of things as well. And so with that, why are we here? And so I mean that on a very literal level, as why are we on Zoom now, but more broadly, why are we on Earth as a human species? I've already talked about those things. So they're the goals. Why are we here for these sessions? And I hope in the coming times, as we tackle different topics, we'll kind of pick up different skills and things along the way. All right. So why are we here? Where do we come from? Where do we go when we die? That's one of my favorite songs, those lyrics. Not a Christian song, actually, interestingly. So this is some real picture stuff. And I find people might ponder it as they get older and, become more aware of their mortality. Or maybe people think of it late at night when they can't sleep. Or maybe some people don't think of it at all. But they're big pictures, and as humans, we're just not equipped to answer them. We don't have all the answers. We can only come up with our best educated guesses, so to speak. But what people don't realize, I think, is the importance of these things through our lives as we live. And so some people might think, did we start with a big bang, or was there a big God that made it? Who cares? Why does that affect my life today? Did we get here by evolution, or were we fearfully and wonderfully made by a loving God? Who cares? How does that affect me today? And when we die, am I going to be worm food? Or is there a place that's especially prepared for God based on whether I followed him during my life? And so I think that a lot of people overlook the importance of that until later in their lives, but actually drive our everyday decisions and what we do now. So I just want to draw attention to that today. And so I'm going to generalize a bit, well, a lot. But depending on where you believe on these scales, or obviously it's a spectrum, you might sit somewhere in the middle, it affects how you go about things. And so to use a really generalized example, someone who believes we're made by a big bang in evolution, we're worm food when we die, life is just a big accident. And, and all you can do is enjoy it while you're here, because it's going to end and then you're done, the end, nothing else to worry about. And so people can approach that in different ways. You kind of get the stereotype of, well, I'm just going to party and be happy while I'm here. I'm going to try and build the best life that I've got here. Or some people think beyond their life here and try and build a lasting legacy. So whether that's fame or discovery or building a business that lasts forever, something like that, so that their name will live on and they'll be remembered. So that all comes from the idea that you are going to be gone and you're just making the most of why you're here. But ultimately, the only purpose or meaning is what you make it. Whereas from a Christian, they pursue it from a different perspective. The fact that a God made us on purpose means it wasn't an accident. And it means that the way we were made was made this way for a reason. So that gives us a purpose. He's given us skills and passions for a reason, so we can go out and fulfill that reason in our life, to do what that is. And we're commanded to live a life that is others focused rather than focused on our own happiness or making our own name live on as a legacy. We hope that if we do have a legacy, it would be that we can bring others to live in heaven as we do as well. And so your approach there will actually affect each and every day of your life, whether or not you're actively thinking it or not. And so with that in mind, we need to understand the Big Bang or the Big God or the evolution or where did we come from, because they're going to drive our everyday decisions. And so I've got a graph here that shows the importance of needing all the information. And so you can see there's not much doing here until about the 1970s. And this is the percentage of people reporting no religion in Australia. This is from the Australian census. And so as you can see, apparently just about everybody reported a religion until 1971. And so obviously the 1960s were a big period of change. A lot of things were going on. A lot of new philosophies were kind of coming to the fore once kind of World War II had settled down. But a significant change in there was that evolution started to be taught in schools during the 1960s. And so for the first time, we had a generation that was taught not that God made the world, but we became here by random chance and chemicals just came together and voila, life happened, monkeys, man, here we are. And so this alternative explanation allows people to turn away from religion and find their own meaning in their lives. And so tackling these issues, has a clear link here in how people go about living their lives. Obviously, there are other factors at play, but there's no doubt that was one key aspect of it. And so, like I mentioned before, the Christian narrative is now hard to come by. You're only going to hear about a biblical perspective in a Christian school these days. You're not allowed to teach that in a state school. It's all evolution, and kids, they don't, unless they're keen to find out or go exploring themselves, they're not even going to hear another side or another possibility, so to speak. And for Christians who interpret the data in a different way, they see the facts of what's there and interpret in a way that doesn't fit with the prevailing evolution model, that they can't get published because all the scientific journals are peer reviewed, and you need to have a really, really, really strong case to get published if your hypothesis doesn't agree with the main idea of the day. And it's purely a competition for space. It's hard to get standard scientific work published, let alone something that goes against the norm. And so it creates a vacuum of, where this information can be shared. And so Christians, so a Christian perspective has to kind of come out through ministries, and not everyone's going to be exposed to ministries, or they can kind of set up their own journals. But as you can imagine, that they'd often just be, the reputation of those journals would be kind of frowned upon in comparison to others. And so evolution's kind of been around for so long now, particularly in academia. It's actually just baked in as an assumption to all we do. I've been reading summaries of non-fiction books, and it seems like I can't get through a book without finding an evolution reference. I was reading a book about music, and it just came up with a bunch about something cavemen and nomads and how music was important for survival or something. Like, it's just baked in as an assumption to everything we do. But I want to look into the assumptions that are baked into evolution and how, it's dangerous to have assumptions relying on assumptions, if you will. It's not as cut and dry as you think it might be presented in what we do. So evolution, I'd like to do a full talk on and go into more detail, but we're going to tackle a few starters today. And so we're going to start with very classic examples, like some base definitions. So evolution's been called a different thing through the years. Like, the definition's actually changed. It's now become more inclusive to the point where anyone would have to admit that yes, evolution happens under that definition. But earlier on, it was a bit different. And so there's actually two different branches of evolution and with different mechanisms. And it's really important that we're versed and understand what those differences are. And so micro and macro, big and small, essentially. And so macroevolution is the idea that life came from this single organism. So this little amoeba and then a jellyfish and a trilobite and fish and lizards and so on and so forth. And so that's macroevolution, the idea that different species, new things can come out from previously different things. And so to ascribe to the idea that we were here by macroevolution means, for those who are interested in ancestry.com, if you go back far enough in your family tree, you will literally find a lizard. You will literally find a jellyfish. I'm going to be really unscientific and ask you the question as whether that sounds right in your heart. Is there a jellyfish in your family tree? All right, and then the other one is microevolution, so small evolution, smaller changes. And so here we have different canines. So we've got the poodle, the wolf, a fox. So these are similar animals which may have had, a common ancestor that they micro-evolved from. But we're not turning fins and wings into fur. We're still talking with, it's very similar origin. And so while these are called separate species, the Bible uses the words kinds. And so you could still consider these one kind if they had a single ancestor, and they still share a lot of commonalities today. And so I want to talk about the differences between these two today. Because microevolution, I think we can all admit that happens. We all see that. There's like viral news videos where you can see how dogs breeds have changed in the last 100 years just through selective breeding, as what we do as humans, what we do to them and how we like their traits. Whereas macroevolution, I think it's harder to find evidence that species just change completely like that. All right, so let's look at an example here. And so let's say we've got some dogs. We've got 4 dogs, a black one and 3 spotty ones. These guys sitting outside the squares here. And so let's say these dogs migrated to a snowy area. You might ask yourself, which coloured dogs would have a best chance of survival? And so based on, the snow and blending in, maybe a lighter dog might be more successful, either escaping from predators because they can hide and not be seen, or they might be better at getting food because they can sneak up on their prey a bit better. And so whereas being a black dog, you'd probably stand out. You'd be seen, you'd be eaten, or you wouldn't be able to find food as well for yourself. And so over time, we expect the lighter dogs to, have a better chance of surviving. And so over time, you might see more lighter dogs, and the black dogs may even die out entirely, depending on how competitive they are. And so what we can see in the little squares here these are indications of the types of offspring that can result from these dogs based on their genes. And so the black dog and the spotty dog can produce either black dogs or spotty dogs. Yeah, that makes sense. But when we have a mix of genes, like the spotty dogs, things are a bit confusing because they can still result in a fully black dog, or they can result in an almost lighter white dog, or as well as the spotty dogs too. And so you can see here that, it looks like those white dogs have just kind of appeared, but that genetic information was already there to begin with. That's represented by the big M and the little m. If you've got 2 different genes here, the big M and the little m, they can result in something that looks a bit different at the end. And so this is an example of microevolution, or adapting to an environment. These lighter white dogs might kind of outplay the spotted or black dogs, but that doesn't mean that much has changed. Like, that was already there. We just, it's becoming more popular. It's becoming cool because that allows them to survive a bit better. And so you might commonly know this is survival of the fittest. And so this is a type of microevolution which we see. But the key is those genetic tools were already there. Nothing new is happening here. It's just a rearrangement or a different popularity. And so I've got a link here for more information on Punnett squares down the bottom. You can read into how these work and what they represent a bit more if you're interested there. So obviously the dog is never a blue dog or a feathered dog or a fins dog. That's a bit of a silly argument, but give those dogs enough time that it's still going to have black dogs, white dogs, or spotty dogs. The only thing that's going to change is the proportion of those. All right, so whereas macroevolution, this is the one that I have a bit more of a beef with. And so I've got a quote here from Berkeley University. This is their website, so they're Standard University. And so they say it's not necessarily easy to see macroevolutionary history. No first-hand accounts to be read. Like, we weren't there, it's a long time ago. And so what we do is we can reconstruct the history of life using the evidence available, geology, fossils, and the living organisms that we have now. And so it's forensics, right? We're using the evidence that we have here and using our best guess to go back and see what we think happened beforehand. And unlike the cop shows, forensic evidence isn't, it's not perfect. Sometimes we don't catch the bad guy because sometimes we don't have all the information, or what we do have leads us kind of down the wrong path. And so the idea of macroevolution, as posited by scientists, the prevailing theory of the day, is that, we have that natural selection from before, the black and white dogs, but we also have genetic drift, genetic flow, and mutation. And so these other different things cause genetic changes. Do it for long enough, 3.8 billion years, you get macroevolution. You get a jellyfish that turns into a monkey that turns into a man. And so of these four mechanisms, we've already established that natural selection can't actually produce something new. It's just popularity of different genes based on their environment. They're still not getting a blue dog. I'm still not getting a dog with fins. So genetic drift and genetic flow, they're also in the same boat. They're all about moving genes around and where they are. There's nothing new happening. It's all about proportions and that kind of stuff. I've got some links here to definitions, a little bit more explanation of those if you're interested in seeing those. And so for macroevolution to really be a thing, we need new stuff. The jellyfish needs to learn how to grow a spleen and a brain. And so that can only happen by mutation, which is where DNA and the genes change. So obviously we need a change for something new to happen. We can't just rearrange the same puzzle pieces and hope for there to be a different picture. And so yes, mutation can produce new genes because the DNA changes and stuff happens. We're going to look at that shortly. But generally they cause problems. And so I've got a link here. That's from, I think it might be New Scientist. It's a scientific website. It's talking about the problems of genes because mutations happen randomly. And if you randomly change the words in a book, you're going to have problems. It's going to get harder to understand. You're not going to make the book better by chance, probably. It's probably going to make it worse. And so let's have a look at some examples of how that works. All right, so mutations. Oh, we're going to do some proper science now. So here on the left, I've got a strand of DNA. So you're probably familiar with this double helix. This twisted ladder shape. You've probably seen it on science shows and movies or whatever. This is what DNA looks like as a physical object. And so it has the sugar phosphate backbone, which holds it together. But the interesting part is these rungs of the ladder in the middle. You can see here they actually have different colors. What's that? Blue, black, red, and green. And so these different colors represent different chemicals: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And we abbreviate them as letters because they're big words. So A, T, C, and G. And so what this does is you can read this DNA like a book. You can read each letter, and each letter communicates information that causes a gene to happen and be made. And so how that works is basically our body reads them in groups of 3. So maybe this AAA here. And depending on what 3 letters are there, it kind of interprets the code and it spits out an amino acid. And amino acids, when we string them together on a rope like that, so I read in groups of 3s and get different shapes, different things. And I put them all together in a chain, and this makes a protein. And so that's why it's important to eat protein, because you need these to do everything in your body just about. You would cease to function without them. And so what happens is, once you've got all these different things on a chain, these guys actually have likes and dislikes. Maybe the square doesn't want to hang out with the circle. Maybe the square wants to hang out with the other squares. And so once you've got hundreds of these on a rope, they're all just going to arrange themselves and kind of, fill around like that. And they'll eventually settle on a shape where everyone is the most happy. Maybe all the squares are hanging together. Maybe all the circles are on the far side because they don't like them. And so these letters and their specific order causes a physical, very specific shape to form. And in biology, shape gives function. That's how things work. And so its shape is its job. and its shape is dictated by the letters and their order. And so if you were to change these letters and their order, you might change the result. Instead of this, you might get this, and it'll do a different job because it has a different shape. And so that's the idea behind how mutations might cause new things, new genes to happen. Maybe my dog will grow fins because of mutations in its DNA like this. And it's also worth noting that DNA code is the only code known to man that we didn't make. It's the only code that we find in nature. So I find that really interesting because that's information right there and it's interpreted. That's code. That implies intelligence to me. All right. And so here's an example of insulins. This one's made up of 74 amino acids. So 74 squares and circles and triangles. They've all arranged in their certain way. And you get this very specific shape that looks like this. And it's this very specific shape that allows insulin to do its job. And so what's insulin's job? Well, its job is to plug into cells like this. So its very specific shape has a very specific receptor. So it's like a lock, a key going into a lock. And that allows it to do its job, which is to allow sugar into cells, because that's important. And so the only way to have this job to happen is to have that specific shape of insulin. How do I get the specific shape of insulin? That specific row of letters in that precise order. And a mutation in those letters is going to cause, well, probably problems, but a change of some sort. All right. And so you can see, or probably just guess, if you're changing letters at random, you're probably going to have problems, right? So here we go. So here's an example of a bunch of changes. So this is all exactly the same, except for one little highlighted letter that gets changed here. And so I've got my top thing here, I've got my string of letters, cool, and then they make these proteins based on those amino acids. But if I change this one letter here, what's that? I change an A to a G. That's called a silent mutation. Nothing happens because some series of letters still make the same amino acids. So that doesn't matter. Sometimes there's a missense mutation, which will change it. So instead of a leucine, we get a serine. So changing a letter will change this amino acid. Maybe it'll introduce another square to hang out with the other squares, and it'll cause that shape entirely. Sometimes it'll tell the thing to stop entirely, and you'll only get half a protein. It'll just break and probably not work. Or sometimes if you have one letter added in, it actually messes up every single amino acid after that, because it's, instead of reading this 3 and that 3, it's reading the 3 next to it. And so the overlap's wrong, and it just ruins the whole thing from that point forward. And so you can see all the kinds of nonsense and craziness that happens just from changing one letter in a DNA sequence. And so if one was to change from a mutation, I'd argue that we're going to see more problems than good things, and that is in fact what we do see. So let's look at the numbers here. So each and every single one of your cells has 2 copies of 3 billion DNA letters in it. So 70 trillion cells times 2 copies of 3 billion DNA letters. That's a lot of letters to get right. And so there's a copying error rate of 1 in 100,000. So when you grow, your cells divide, you make a new cell with new DNA, and 1 in 100,000 times they get that wrong. So that sounds pretty good, but with the amount of numbers we're talking, you actually get 120,000 errors per cell, which isn't good. And so this is one way that mutations can be introduced. And so as we age, that makes us more susceptible to cancers. We get more errors in our genes, and sometimes you might break the signals that tell our cells to stop dividing, and they just keep dividing and growing, and that's how you might get a tumor in your body. And so our body does fix 99% of these errors, but you're still left with about 1,200 errors. And so that's when mutations and things can happen. And so from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that sure, there's going to be a lot of bad mutations in that bunch, but sometimes you might get one that's really beneficial, which would allow things to grow and improve, and that'll turn your jellyfish into a human if you do it for 4 billion years. And so that's kind of the idea that they're coming from. And so I've got to give them credit there. Like, that absolutely can happen. But it's also worth noting that life is quite complicated, right? So we were talking about one gene, one insulin, one protein, but it's worth noting that something like your height can have 400 separate genes, each with their own specific DNA code, which influences something like your height. And so it's very, very complicated. As soon as you've got 400 things interacting with each other and you start changing any of those things, can't even wrap your head around it. All right, so possible, yes. Moving on. So one of my next favorite examples is this little guy. And so this is what's being deemed irreducible complexity. And so that is the idea that you can't make something any simpler without breaking it. And so this is a flagellum motor. And so this is a little spinny guy that lives on the surface of a bacteria. And so this helps a bacteria to go around like a little boat motor. They actually like flick their little tail and spin it and they move along. Except this thing is 45 nanometers wide. We're talking some sophisticated engineering here. And so you can see as it spins and moves, it looks like an engine, but it's a little part of a bacteria. And so why is this important to us? Well, the idea of irreducible complexity. So this little boat motor here has 20 unique pieces as evidenced here. So we've got some schematic diagrams and then some actual electron microscopy images of this is what it looks like in real life. You can see that tail, and then you can see that little boat motor there. That's 200 angstroms, and angstrom is like the width of a hydrogen atom or something. Like we're talking crazy small. And has 20 unique pieces. And what's interesting here is if you take out one of those pieces and leave 19 left, it breaks. It doesn't work anymore. You need each and every single one of those 20 pieces to function. And so a challenge for evolution here is how can 20 separate genes arrive by an accident caused by mutations, not just exist in the same time in the same place, but come together and work like this perfectly oiled machine. And so sure, you can argue 4 billion years, anything can happen. Maybe they appeared one at a time and they were just kind of hanging around, and then eventually they just kind of fell together and voila. And once it worked, you know, those bacteria that can move, man, they had this huge competitive advantage. Yeah, very unlikely, but sure, that might happen. But there is one problem with that. So I've worked with bacteria in a lab, and I've actually put DNA genes into that bacteria. And so I took a gene that wasn't in it and I put it in there because I wanted to see what that gene does. Or maybe I wanted it to make lots of that protein so I could harvest it and use it somewhere. And so that's how we get insulin for diabetics. We actually use bacteria to make it and spit it out by sticking the genes in it. It's a bit funky. And so the reason I bring that up is if I put a DNA gene in a bacteria, it will spit it out in 5 minutes flat. It does not want that extra DNA because there's a huge energy investment. Because DNA, you know, 3 billion letters for humans, that's a lot of stuff. That's nutrition that they need to make it happen. And so they'll spit it out. And so granted, that's not in their genome. It's only a bit of extra DNA I'm putting in. But it shows the importance of keeping a lean, mean fighting machine when you're a little guy like these. And so I find it very difficult to believe that they were just carrying around a whole bunch of proteins, you know, up to 20, that didn't contribute anything. When in the meantime, they're actually going to drag that organism down and cause it to die out through survival of the fittest, through natural selection. And so that's another reason that kind of, you know, evolution doesn't make a whole sense to me. I don't think you could get through the 4 billion years carrying this stuff and not be a liability. Big energy commitment. All right, so I've kind of waffled on about evolution a lot. We'll go into it more another time. I want to touch on fossils quickly. And I'm going to talk about radiometric dating in coming weeks in one of our upcoming topics. And so I've got a picture here. This is an image of the fossil record. And so this is from the Royal Ontario Museum. So they are Canadian government funded. Oh, I read it there. So they were a university in 1912 and they're commandeered by the government because they're doing good stuff. And so they're one of the largest and most respected institutions in Canada. So they produced this graphic about the Cambrian explosion where lots of new animals came into existence according to that model. And they've drawn on a bunch of papers. I've tried to link to some, but a lot of them were paywalled. I couldn't actually read them. But they've taken all of these papers and kind of put it into one image here. And so you can see there's all these different weird things. Oh, there we go. We've got mice and starfish and crustaceans and arachnids and all that stuff. And so what here is the red lines, hopefully you can see this, where we have a fossil record for that thing. And so here we have fossils for this, red we have fossils for that, and so on and so forth. But the others, the dotted lines, and may I note the majority, we do not have a fossil record for. That is our best guess as to what happened. And so I look at this image and I see a lot of dotted lines and not a lot of reds. And to even connect any of those red lines, requires, guesswork. We can't prove that they connected or came from the same thing based on the evidence that we have. And so I'm kind of flabbergasted when I see something like this, that we teach this as facts to our students, but the evidence is thinner than we probably give it credit for. And so, granted, coming from my perspective, that's easy for me to see it that way. But I think there's danger in not examining the assumptions behind the things that we just take for granted, especially if we're going to teach it as fact and bake it into our philosophies when we're talking about music in other books. And so don't get me wrong, science is bankable, science is great. We do great things. We make rockets, we make Wi-Fi, but these things all rely on observational science. We look at things, we have a theory, we do a test, we do the test, see what happens. We repeat the test lots of times to make sure it still happens. And then we can say yes or no, this thing happens or doesn't happen. But when we're going back in time, doing forensics like this, we weren't there. We don't have all the information. I can't see it happen. I certainly can't repeat it. And what is there is degraded or changed a long time in the billions of years since. And so it's not on the same level of the stuff that gives us rockets and Wi-Fi. It's our best educated guess, using that evidence to come up with a theory or an interpretation, using our best knowledge and our best ideas from that. And so when I look at this and I see different animals and different fossil records and a large array of species buried, I just see Noah's flood, because fossilization is actually really, really rare. It only happens when something is buried quickly, where oxygen can't get to it and scavengers can't get to it. So basically it has to be buried in mud or dirt really, really quickly. So it's a really rare event. And I think a global flood, you're going to get heaps of stuff getting fossilized in no time flat. And there are places in America where there's this valley, it's just this pile of dinosaur bones that just been, I think, washed into one place and just a mass grave as a result of something like a global flood. And so I look for the simple and I see, well, is it all this and all this guesswork, or is there a simpler explanation for what happened here? All right, guys, so that was a lot of stuff, a lot of science for this time of night. It's hurting my brain. So I just want to remind you the goal of these sessions. So thinking about the bigger picture, how did we get here? What's the point of it? Where are we going? We can see that it matters, that it drives our decisions each and every day. And they hinge on things like this. And I hope I showed today that they aren't as cut and dried. The case isn't as closed as it's often presented. So I don't expect everyone to believe everything I say, and that's cool. But I want to open a dialogue and, just put forward the idea that, hey, maybe things aren't quite as they seem at the beginning. And together we work through this. I want to learn. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to know where you're coming from and to talk about that. And we can learn a lot together and come to conclusions from that. And so I'd like to finish with this one from Job. It says, but ask the beasts and they will teach you. The birds of the heaven, they will tell you. The bushes of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea. Who among these things does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? And so if it's obvious to them, maybe it can be obvious to us as well. All right, so I've got some references and links at the end there. So some of those were extra definitions or links to that news article that I mentioned. So I'll make these slides available and you're most welcome to click on those and have a look yourself.